everybody and welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to be filming my April wrap-up a little bit late. So I actually ended up reading a ton during the month of April. I attribute some of that to a 24-hour read-a-thon that I ended up doing at the beginning of the month, and a lot of audiobook listening too. This was definitely the month of audiobooks. But I read a lot of romance, which is outside of my usual genre, and I had a great time doing it. So let's just get into the books that I read this month. First up, I started this book at the last few days of March, but I finished it in April, so I'm counting it as an April book, and that was the Bromance Book Club by Lyssa K. Adams. This was a adult romance book centered around a baseball player who finds out that a bunch of his friends and a bunch of really famous celebrities in the Nashville area get together and read romance novels in order to better understand their wives. He finds this out as he is going through a struggle with his own wife, who decides that she wants a divorce, and he has to try to learn more about her and decides to do that through this book club. This book was super fun and really enjoyable. I really thought the romance was believable, and their struggles and their problems were very believable, but I just really enjoyed it overall. I ended up giving it a 4 out of 5 stars. Next up, this was one of my most anticipated books of the entire year of 2021, and that was Actor Age Eve Brown by Talia Hibbert. This is the third and final book in the Brown Sisters companion series. They are adult fiction books, all following 3 sisters. The first one is Get a Life Chloe Brown, the second one was Take a Hint Dani Brown, and this third one, Actor Age Eve Brown. I loved this so much. I love the Brown Sisters companion series just so much in general. They're my favorite romance books I've ever read in my life, and some of my favorite books just in general. All the characters are so diverse and so different and so real. They aren't just caricatures. They all have such rich personalities and are super relatable. Specifically, my favorite of the series is actually Take a Hint Dani Brown, because Dani is the one that's most relatable to me specifically. But I adored Eve Brown so much. I thought she was such a great character. Each of these books has a different type of disability rep, which is, again, very relatable and very necessary in stories, especially romance stories, because disability is often mischaracterized as being something you don't want to see in a romance or a happy story, and it seems to be typically attributed to struggle. But I really adore the way that Talia Hibbert incorporates disability into her stories and how she makes these characters just so full and rich and entertaining. Anyway, the main love interest in this is autistic, and just the way that they meet is so hilarious, and they're like enemies to lovers. Slow burn romance was just chef's kiss. I absolutely adored it. I gave it a 5 out of 5 stars. Then next up, I started a 24-hour read-a-thon. I was actually participating in one of the impromptu read-a-thons, which is hosted by JD Ray Reads. I decided to try and read the entire Reluctant Royals romance series by Alyssa Cole. I almost succeeded. But anyway, the first book in that series is A Princess in Theory, and this follows 2 characters in New York City. One, Letty, who is a girl working multiple jobs in grad school. She was raised in the foster care system, so she doesn't really have a huge amount of support backing her through her struggle in school and in affording school and living on her own, all that kind of stuff. She's a very independent girl. She ends up getting all these letters from or emails from a Prince Thabiso, who is a prince of a small African country, who is claiming that they have been betrothed for their entire lives and that she is to wed a prince. Very much akin to the typical email scams that people tend to get. But this time it's real. So she learns a lot about her backstory, and her and Biso end up on this really interesting journey throughout their romance. And it's kind of questionable at first, but it gets so great as the story goes on, and the way that they develop their relationship is just so pure, and I adore it. I gave this a 5 out of 5 stars. Next in the series is A Duke by Default, which follows Letty's best friend Portia as she goes on a self-discovery trip to Scotland in order to work as an apprentice to a swordsmaker who is named Tav. Tav is a divorced, angry, business owner who doesn't have the time for the snobbish American spoiled brat that is coming to work under him as a swords master, but the two of them end up reluctantly falling in love, and it was fantastic. This was my favorite one out of the series, and I also gave it a 5 out of 5 stars. Next up was the first of the novellas, because I was reading these in chronological order. This one follows Likotsi, who is the assistant to Thabiso in A Princess in Theory. This is her novella called Once Ghosted, Twice Shy. It follows her and her love interest, Fabiola, who is a native New Yorker. They meet during the encounters in A Princess in Theory, and then they are separated. They are torn apart. Fabiola ghosts Likotsi, and later on, after the events of Princess in Theory, they all move back to New York, and these two rekindle their relationship and go through what happened and what made them split up in the first place. I really adored this. I loved the sapphic romance that was in it. I loved the character of Likotsi. She's so independent and so like sure of herself and confident, and I really enjoyed that. But yeah, I adored this one as well. I gave it a 4 out of 5 stars. I just wish it was longer. That was my only critique. And then next up, I read Can't Escape Love. This is the second novella, also taking place between Duke by Default and the next full-length novel. This one follows Regina, who is the sister of Portia from A Duke by Default. Regina is a self-proclaimed disabled geek. She is the runner of a very massive and influential pop culture website blog called Girls with Glasses. She is a wheelchair user and she rarely leaves her house. She's very independent and very anxiety ridden. One of the symptoms of that said anxiety is insomnia, and what she uses to fall to sleep every night is this one streamer who just does puzzles on stream, but she really loves his voice. Gus, who runs this stream, ends up abruptly stopping it and takes down his entire archive. And Regina panics because it's the only thing that can help her fall asleep at night. So she ends up reaching out to him, and they make an agreement that he will record his voice for her and allow her to fall asleep using his voice in exchange for her help in his current work project, which is to create an anime specific themed escape room, which happens to be one of her favorite shows of all time. I adored this so much. I want another full-length novel about Regina and Gus. They were such interesting characters, and I loved all the pop culture references. Regina was so relatable as a character, and again, I just absolutely adored this story. I gave it a 5 out of 5 stars. Next up, I read a graphic novel that I saw on Chloe's channel over at Books with Chloe, and that was Fangs by Sarah Anderson. Sarah Anderson has a very famous comic strip that I think most people have seen. I'll insert some pictures of it here. But this is the story of a vampire who falls in love with a werewolf. It's full of just like stupid puns and jokes that I adore, and the art style was super fun. I'll try and find some pages. Like, this is what it looked like. It was just so freaking cute, and it was such a fun little read. I read it in like 15 minutes. It's super short, but it was so much fun, and I gave it a 4 out of 5 stars. Next up was the first audiobook that I listened to this month, and that was A Mind Spread Out on the Ground by Alicia Elliott. This was a nonfiction Indigenous memoir of Alicia Elliott, who is a part of Six Nations here in Ontario. She's actually a local author to me. She grew up in the same town that I did, which I didn't know until going into it, which was super interesting to hear. But this was a very poignant memoir, super quick audiobook, and it was narrated by Alicia herself, and I really enjoyed listening to her story and specifically getting a better view of what life is like on the Six Nations res, and seeing more about like some actual local issues to me living in Ontario, Canada. I really enjoyed it. I haven't been reading my nonfiction lately, but I do think it was a fantastic listen if you need to learn more about Indigenous history. Next up, on a whim, I picked up a classic, and this one was actually Theogony and Works and Days by Hesiod. This is a like general overview of Greek mythology, basically, from the actual ancient Greek time. I got this on recommendation from Jean over at Jean's Thoughts, so I'll leave her channel linked down below, but I really enjoyed this. It was kind of like dense, but it was very much just a bit of epic poetry going over the like chronological family tree of all of the Olympian gods. And again, I enjoyed it. I gave it a 3 out of 5 stars. I thought it was interesting. Again, but it was a little bit dense, so I don't know, if you like Greek mythology, I recommend reading it to get a little bit of a, not firsthand, but like primary source to Greek mythology. Next up, this was super quick and like super unexpected. I ended up getting my pre-order for Rule of Wolves by Leigh Bardugo, the second book in the King of Scars duology, and the final book to the duology, obviously. This one just arrived on my doorstep the day after me and Tyler ended up watching the entirety of Shadow and Bone in one day, and so I had to read it the next day. I sat down and I read it, and I didn't really move from the couch. It was great. I can't really talk about the plot because it'll really spoil the actual rest of the Grishaverse, basically. But this is the third series in the Grishaverse world written by Leigh Bardugo, and it involves characters in both the Shadow and Bone trilogy and the Six of Crows duology. But I really adore this duology. I think it's actually my favorite series in the world of the Grisha, and the characters in it just make me so happy. They're so much more well developed from their original source material, and just seeing their stories continue on make me just so incredibly happy. I think this is one of the best, like, well wrapped up endings to a series that I've ever read. I think it was one of the most well thought out series I've ever read, and I absolutely adored it. I gave it a 5 out of 5 stars. Next up, I redid my Animal Crossing. I completely restarted my island, so I had a lot of stuff to do on Animal Crossing, so I was listening to a lot of audiobooks. I ended up picking up on a whim Daisy Jones and the Six by Taylor Jenkins Reid. I have heard many great things about this, and many great things about Taylor Jenkins Reid in general. I've read The Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo this time last year. I also listened to the audiobook, and I knew that this one, since it was again interview style and focused around a musical topic, that the audiobook was going to be great. The audiobook was a full cast, and this follows the story of the independent singer Daisy Jones and the band The Six back in the 60s and 70s, who got put together by their record label and became a worldwide phenomenon. These are fictionalized characters, fictionalized bands, but it felt so real. I really, really, really enjoyed the full cast audio interview format. I think it made it go by really fast, and it really got me invested in their story, and it made it feel very real, like an actual biography. But I absolutely adored this. I flew through it, and it was another 5 out of 5 stars for me. Next up was another audiobook that I just picked up from my library, and this one was one that I picked up because I have decided late in the year to participate in Books and Lala's Buzzword-a-thon, and the word that had to be in the title of a book you read for April was anything space themed, so I ended up picking up the audiobook for The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy by Douglas Adams. This is a classic sci-fi book that I've never read, and I really did enjoy it. It was narrated by Stephen Fry, which I just absolutely adored, but it was weird. It was weird, wonderful, and just like absolutely hysterical. And the audiobook narration by Stephen Fry was great. It was super quick. It was super short. The audiobook only took like 3 hours to get through on double speed, which is what I listened to. But overall, I enjoyed it, and I gave it a 4 out of 5 stars. And then finally, the last audiobook and the last book that I read in April was Sadie by Courtney Summers. This one I've had on my Audible for over a year. I just hadn't got around to listening to it. Sadie follows the story of Sadie, who is a girl from a very small town in the rural US whose little sister had gone missing and turned out murdered, I think about 6 months before the start of the book. And then all of a sudden, Sadie herself actually goes missing. This book follows a very interesting format as well, which is another reason I wanted to listen to the audiobook, in which it is half first-person narration from Sadie of the events after her disappearance, combined with a like recorded podcast style rest of the book. So it followed a character named Wes, who's a reporter, who was brought in by Sadie's like surrogate grandmother to figure out what happened to Sadie. It was very like reminiscent of the true crime podcast Serial, and the way that they incorporated things like birds chirping in the background of interviews that were meant to take place outside, and hearing background noises and hearing the little buzz of a tape recorder, like all that kind of stuff really, really, really made it feel real, like it was an actual interview being turned into a podcast. and I really enjoyed it. I really, really loved this audiobook. It was dark, it was twisted, it was creepy. It has many, many trigger warnings that I recommend you look up before you go into this, because it's very dark and it deals with very dark subject matter, as most true crime stories tend to. But again, I absolutely adored this audiobook. It was such an interesting ride. I was very captivated right from the beginning, and it kept me wondering, it kept me guessing all the way through to the end, even throughout the end. The ending was very ambiguous, which I think lent itself well to the subject matter, but I really, really enjoyed it. I gave it a 5 out of 5 stars. It was great. Thank you guys so much for watching. I really hope you enjoyed this video. If you read any of the books that I read during the month of April, let me know down in the comments below, and give this video a thumbs up if you did enjoy. If you're new here, please subscribe. I put up new bookish and writing videos every week, and I'll talk to you guys later. Bye-bye.